Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh. The 2026 Middle East war continues to rage and the whole world is caught up in it in some way or the other. And we in Sri Lanka are particularly vulnerable to the shocks of such a war. And to discuss all this, I have with me Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, who is a well-known foreign policy analyst. Good evening and welcome back, Kusum.
Thank you, Niresh. Thanks a lot for having me.
Right, Kusum, the rest of the world, what's it doing with regard to this ferocious war which is going on throughout the Middle East? And in the past we had wars in the Middle East which were restricted. You had Iran, Iraq, you had the two Gulf Wars, you had the invasion of Iraq by the US and so on. And then you also had Gaza happening over the past couple of years. But mainly they were fairly limited. This one, it just seems to be all over the place. Every country in the Middle East seems to be involved, and this is having a huge impact far beyond.
Yes, Niresh. So I think this is the logical conclusion of what has begun during the Trump term. It's been about a year now of the Trump presidency. And what we've seen in this one-year period, for example, with American allies in the Middle East, whether it's Saudi Arabia and the bombing of Yemen, whether it's the total obliteration of Gaza by Israel. American foreign policy has its impacts in the Middle East, as we've seen throughout history. Israel, as America's main ally, the most special relationship I think that the United States has with a foreign country, have themselves bombed something like 6 or 7 countries, if you count Syria, Lebanon, parts of Jordan, the outskirts, Gaza itself. They have had expansion into the West Bank. They've attacked Iran. So this is the logical endpoint. The logical endpoint, I think, when you consider Operation Midnight Hammer, just a matter of within the last 6 months of the first 6 months of the Trump administration, and what was supposed to be a complete annihilation of the Iranian nuclear program. Now we are hearing that that was not quite the case, or that they are back to enriching uranium, or that the Iranians were very close to developing a nuclear bomb. So there's all sorts of excuses that's going on. I have to tell you, Niresh, that anyone in the international relations sphere that researches this and analyzes this, what we are seeing right now happening in the Middle East is hard to wrap your head around. Even when you take some of the conflicts from history that some of the younger viewers may have read about, but certainly you and I lived through, let's say the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Most people recall this as an illegal offensive invasion. They remember the story about weapons of mass destruction, the excuses, and the ideas behind this attack by the United States at the time, and how the evidence fell apart, how it was proven that there were no WMDs. But I just want to remind your audience that when you go back even to 2003, President George W. Bush actually went to Congress. He sought congressional approval. He sent his Secretary of State and also General Colin Powell to make the case to the American people. They provided evidence which turned out to be fake, but nonetheless, they took these steps to at least engage with the democratic process and the people's representatives within the United States. What's happening right now, Niresh, I think it's important for our viewers to wrap our heads around. We've been told that regimes like Iran, for instance, these are authoritarian dictatorships. They're not democracies. So that creates a certain lack of legitimacy in the eyes of the Western commentariat on the Ayatollah, on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. But I just want people to understand that in the United States, there's recent polling that's come out that it's not even 20% of the American population that supports direct military strikes on Iran. As I said, there has been no congressional approval. There has been no congressional debate in either the upper house in the Senate or in the houses of Congress. So this shows a complete lack of democratic oversight of this operation by Donald Trump in the United States. And I think this is perhaps the most crucial point for everyone to understand, is that a democratic state, one of the most advanced, the most powerful military in the world, is being utilized without democratic oversight. And that's something that I think must be taken into consideration. And the other fact of the matter is that what we see today with these actions of the United States and Israel is this sort of bifurcation of this international system. And whatever you say about the speech that Canadian Prime Minister Mr. Mark Carney made, just a matter of a month ago or so, talking about the double standards within the international system and how Canada was keenly aware of this, how it's just a pretense. But his most recent comments, once again, seemingly saying that he accepts the need for this Iranian offensive with regret. Now, what does that even mean? If you are unable to call out a blatant disregard for international norms and international law, a completely blatant offensive illegal war in Iran, and this is after Midnight Hammer, which itself was a historic, quite difficult to believe that Midnight Hammer even occurred. But the fact that you've now had a 2 or 3 day offensive, which is, as you said, spreading out into virtually every part of the Middle East now. This is the direct outcome of American foreign policy, and there's absolutely no other way to say it. Countries like the UAE, for instance, they have to now start looking at their own foreign policy. The UAE cannot claim to be, for example, neutral, given their alliances with the United States, given their operations in Sudan, and given their alliances with Israel. And now they've become a target, and this is a country that depends on a certain amount of safety, stability for its tourism, for its investment climate. So similarly, there are so many countries around the Gulf that should be looking at this. There are so many countries in Western Europe that may have to deal with, if there is a collapse of the Iranian regime, whatever replaces that regime. How about the issue of asylum seekers? There could be asylum seekers across the Middle East because of the bombings that are taking place, all over the place. And yet what we see is Western leaders simply unwilling to stand up for international law, simply unwilling to stand up to the Trump administration. And I think this, if nothing else, this should accelerate the new world order that everyone keeps speaking about. And I'm sure we'll discuss it later on in the show, but I'm incredibly skeptical when you consider not just the response from the European countries, but even the response from the Gulf countries. Many of the Gulf countries, including Bahrain, including UAE, they have condemned Iran's retaliation, but there is no condemnation of the strikes on Iran by the United States and Israel. So I think this is the international system right now has so little credibility that it's hard to see how it survives for much longer.
Well, let's take some of the points you made, Kusum. First of all, congressional approval or a declaration of war. So we read in literature, in World War I, World War II, how countries actually declared war. Whether it was World War I, where you had Germany and Austria-Hungary, so on. There were proper declarations of war, letters exchanged saying we are now at war with you. Again, in World War II, even after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, which was without a declaration of war, the US and Britain issued formal declarations of war, even though they were now in hostilities already. So that kind of nicety, I think, has gone by the board, hasn't it? Because we don't see that kind of thing happening. Look at Ukraine. There's no declaration of war. Look at, if you want to go back, Vietnam and so on. No proper, acknowledgement that there is actually a war. I mean, closer to home, India, Pakistan, and so on. So this This declarations of war and congressional approval seem to have certainly gone out the window.
Yes, and this seems to be the case even across other Western democracies like the United Kingdom, for instance. And Prime Minister Starmer, as you may know, is struggling for his political career. He's struggling to keep hold of the leadership of his party and the premiership in the UK, even in the context of such, headwinds politically. He's seemingly unable to take the popular decision to put some distance between the UK and the US and the Trump administration. He seems completely unwilling and unable to stand up for the national interests of the UK. I mean, it's also impossible from a foreign policy point of view, Niresh. You have to justify actions with a certain overarching strategy, with some claim to national interests. It's very important to understand that the national interests of the United States, it's very difficult to decipher how attacking Iran serves the national interests of the United States. And this is another point to be made. This is not controversial to say that, in fact, just yesterday, in fact, last night in the United States, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as well as the Speaker of the House, Republican Representative Mike Johnson, they made comments, and to paraphrase, essentially saying that Marco Rubio stated unequivocally that they were made to understand by Israel and by Netanyahu that Israel was going to attack Iran. And in such a circumstance, the US bases around the Middle East, in Qatar, in the UAE, in Bahrain, these become targets of Iran. And Marco Rubio said that since Israel were going to strike anyway, the United States had no choice but to take the lead so that they could have some control over the operation and over the responses from Iran. This is the same thing that the leader of the House said. Now, what does this tell you? It sort of suggests that there is an outsourcing of American foreign policy to the Knesset and to Netanyahu and his colleagues in Israel. There is no other way to read into those comments. Israel technically is the client state of the United States, not the other way around. But it seems that the United States now has taken up positions and operations that are serving the interests of its client state at the risk of not just the servicemen, not just the military equipment, not just the bases, but of the very coalition, the political coalition that brought Trump into office. So in the case of Starmer, in the case of Trump, in the case of Western European leaders, they are unwilling even to protect their own immediate political futures, even to maintain their own political legitimacy and credibility. They are unwilling to buck. In the case of Trump, he's unwilling to buck the very famous and very powerful Israel lobby and AIPAC and J Street. And in the case of Starmer, he's unwilling to go against the United States. And you brought up Russia and Ukraine. So once again, I think this point about democracy and the people having some say in who goes to war and how they go to war. It is now, I think, clear, most analysts will tell you, that President Putin had far more buy-in from his public to go to war in Ukraine in 2022, 2023. I can't speak for the current moment. It's been 3-4 years since that wars began. So wars become less popular the longer they go along. But just understand that in Ukraine and in Russia, there has been hundreds of thousands of people that have made the ultimate sacrifice for this purported national objectives of both Russia and Ukraine. Now, these niceties, these declarations of war, they used to be standard in conventional warfare. Currently, what we see is not conventional warfare. It is war by proxies, war through allies. This is what's happening with Israel in Gaza, what's happening with Israel around the Middle East. This is what's happening with Ukraine in the Donbass and in Crimea. And this is what's happening when it comes to Israel planting intelligence operatives, funding clandestine networks. We know, for instance, that just in the aftermath of this bombing, some of the local militias around the borders between Iran and Syria have been funded by Mossad to create more chaos along the border. This is all reported. So what we see is this hybrid warfare where you have nation states involved in the war, but they do so not necessarily risking their own troops, but through proxies in various regions. Now, where Mr. President Trump seems to have made a miscalculation is in believing that this operation would be similar to the Venezuelan operation, for instance, where you would be able to decapitate the leadership, to knock out, to assassinate the figurehead of a government, of a state, and then this would lead to a collapse of that state. And in the case of Venezuela, they had a lady called Delcy Rodriguez, who they were trying to push forth as this sort of figurehead new leader that had the backing of America. That didn't turn out to be the case. So then they've had to now rely on people within the former Maduro government. This might be they've tried with the former Shah's son, Reza Pahlavi's son in the United States. I think he lives in Europe. They've tried to bring him forward, but he has no organic support within Iran. Currently, the Ayatollah was never the political leader. He was a spiritual leader. So even though they've been able to assassinate the Minister of Defense, the Defense Secretary, and several other officials, the president of Iran is still in place. He's still in power. There are several government officials that are still in place, still in power. And I think this shows that the United States have underestimated how prepared the Iranians were for this. Because, Neeraj, if you knock out Sri Lanka's army commander, the head of the Navy, the head of the Air Force, to retaliate becomes much more difficult because armies operate on a centralized command. What Iran seems to have done is, after Operation Midnight Hammer, they have decentralized their operational capacity. So now they have platoons and cantons throughout the country where generals and army commanders are in charge of those areas. So there is no centralized link. So you can't now bomb one central location or another central location and say, okay, their army leadership is done. They've thought about this and thought ahead and decentralized. On the other hand, just to come to the tactical aspect, if I can just brief you on this, the United States is using something called the THAAD missile system. And I think THAAD is basically a ground-to-air missile system that intercepts ballistic missiles. Now, during Operation Midnight Hammer, the reporting was that because of the barrage of Iranian missiles and Iranian drones, the United States had to utilize something like 20% of its total stock of THAAD interceptors and missiles. Now, that means that there is some kind of a munition and interceptor crunch going on. On the other hand, Iran, they have a limited stock of ballistic missiles, but that stock does run into the thousands, and they do still have a few thousand left. And more importantly, they're using these drones. Some of these drones are as cheap as $10,000, $50,000, maybe $100,000. But these drones come in swarms, in hundreds. And the United States needs to use several, sometimes maybe dozens of $1 million interceptor missiles to intercept these drones. So the asymmetry here in the costs is going to play to Iran's advantage because the United States simply, for one, does not have the capability to produce such THAAD missiles at a rate. They don't have the drone technology to produce the kind of small-scale drones that are causing so much damage around the Middle East and to US air bases and to the USS carriers. So there is going to be a point where the United States will have to take stock of its own position and its own military. Because remember, no matter how powerful your military is, if you're going to attack a country that's thousands of miles away, it takes a lot of logistical preparation. That's why even this operation took all of 3 to 4 weeks. It took weeks for them to send their battleships, their warships, the aircraft carriers to the Persian Gulf. And it was under the pretext of negotiations that they did this as well. So I think in any way you look at it, this is just a completely underprepared, undercooked operation. And there are no discernible strategic objectives that analysts have been able to point out from the United States point of view. And this does seem like a war on behalf of the client state of the United States.
Now, Kusum, let's talk about the peculiarity of this war in that it is being fought with technology. We don't see a clash of two great armies on the ground or two or more. In fact, the absence of ground warfare is quite striking here. It's air forces, navies, which are battling it out. Neither the United States nor Iran has made any move to take this to a land warfare phase. The US has not even mentioned invading any part of Iran. Iran is not talking about invading the Gulf states or anyone else. So this is completely being fought with technology in the air and, of course, on the sea as well. So this is quite peculiar, isn't it?
Yes, it is. In fact, it's good that you mentioned this, Niresh, because there is a very famous war historian called Robert Pape, who was giving an interview just yesterday. And he was saying that his research shows that in the history of modern warfare, since you've had aircrafts and airplanes and jets dropping bombs, you have never had a successful regime change operation that can be manufactured from the air. It always requires boots on the ground. So in that sense, right now, as you said, there does not seem to be any plan, although there was an American official, I can't remember her name, but she did stress that, it might have been Caroline Leavitt, the spokesperson, who stressed that there is no need for a large American contingent on the ground in Iran. So the operative word is large. So when you say large, what does that mean? You don't need a large one. So a large one could be 10,000. So then maybe 1,000 troops could be considered acceptable based on that kind of statement. So we don't know, right? And President Trump has already stated in his first address that he made after the first attack took place in Iran, he said that there have already been casualties, American casualties, and there could be more. So this could be sort of a, what do you call it, a trial balloon to see what the American public thinks. The American public are not going to be impressed with this in any way, shape, or form. In fact, a large part of the coalition that brought Donald Trump into office was an anti-war coalition, whether it was young people, whether it was part of the minority vote that he got. They voted against American interventionism.
But Kusum, is Donald Trump interested in what his voters think anymore? Because this is his second term, so he's not running for office. However, he does need the support of Congress, which is at the moment ruled by his party. He needs that to continue, or it becomes difficult for him to govern, because Congress can always pass laws and withhold budgets and so on. But apart from that, he doesn't really seem to care what the American voter thinks.
Yes, this Trump administration, I think, has crossed the sort of lines that you wouldn't even be able to imagine. I mean, when we looked at the first Trump term, I mean, let's just take a look at the first Trump term and the foreign policy towards Israel. Now, everyone understands that this is a very sensitive, delicate situation in Israel. This is before October 7th, right? This is before the March of Peace on the wall. This is as Donald Trump comes into office in 2016, 2017. We have had, close to several years of, zero movement towards a Palestinian state. Now, in that context, President Trump comes in, and there are certain red lines in that conflict that no American president has crossed. For example, moving the American embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv, declaring Jerusalem as the undivided capital. And Jerusalem is one of the main sticking points in negotiations between Israel and a future Palestinian state. Recognizing sovereignty over the resource-rich Golan Heights in Syria, which is another thing that President Trump did. Exiting the JCPOA and sanctioning Iran. Some of the most crippling sanctions that have ever been placed on Iran were under the first Trump administration. Now, these were all red lines that nobody would cross because they sent a message. And I've always said this, that October 7th is partly a reaction to Trump policies like the Golan Heights, like the moving of the embassy, and indeed the Abraham Accords, and the Trump peace plan from his first term for Palestine, which excluded the Palestinians from the negotiations. The Palestinians did not want to participate because they'd already given up so much in terms of the Golan Heights and all of this. So when you draw a line from that Trump administration, you would think that was an extreme Trump administration. They were doing things that nobody would have dreamt of. But now, this is completely beyond the pale, what is happening. And it's not conspiracy. For example, during the first term, the number one donor to the Trump campaign was Sheldon Adelson, who is a Jewish billionaire casino magnate in the United States, well known for being a pro-Israel supporter. I think they supported the Trump administration campaign from 2016 onwards to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. In the 2024 election cycle, the exact same thing. Mr. Adelson passed away during the Trump administration. His wife took over the philanthropy, and again they funded the Trump campaign for hundreds of millions of dollars. So this is the result and the outcome of that kind of lobbying. Now, in such a context, I think we have to understand whatever anyone may think about the Ayatollah. I am certainly not a supporter of organizing societies and countries and nation states based on religion. As a secularist, I don't think this is a good idea. But I think to view, and some of the commentary does this, they view Ayatollah Khamenei as evil, as undesirable, the good guys and bad guys viewpoint of politics. This is not the way you analyze politics, right, and international politics. You have to understand that within Iran, there are multiple factions. In many ways, the Ayatollah, the late Ayatollah, the most recent late Ayatollah, was a moderator to even more hardline factions in Iran. In fact, he was seen as sort of an obstacle by some of the more hardline elements. He was seen as an obstacle by some of the more liberal elements, the reformist elements in Iran. So, and let's also understand, he is a spiritual leader. And we know that this part of the world takes their religion and their spirituality extremely seriously. So it's not just a political leader that was assassinated, it's a spiritual leader. And you have huge Shiite populations throughout the Middle East, including in Bahrain, in Iraq, in Iran. These people take this stuff very, very seriously. And you cannot just murder a religious leader, the Ayatollah of Iran. I mean, just the idea that I've had to say this on live TV is mind-boggling. The fact that they've been able to assassinate the Ayatollah. Now, the other point that I think just isn't mentioned by the mainstream media is the religious aspect of this war. You had the American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, in an interview with the American journalist Tucker Carlson, basically saying that these operations by Israel and the United States in the Levant are completely authorized by biblical narrative. I mean, they call on biblical narrative. They mention the Amalek. They mention eschatology, which is the end times, the Armageddon argument. Just yesterday, there was reporting from an independent journalist called Jonathan Larson, who mentioned that there were over 100 complaints from military officers at over 30 installations, American installations, complaining about senior officers invoking the Bible, invoking Armageddon to justify the operations that are occurring in the Middle East. These were complaints that had been reported in the United States. So when you have an American ambassador basically quoting Deuteronomy and Genesis, when you have members of the armed forces complaining about this, and when you have Trump himself, a big part of his support base are the Christian nationalists, right? Christian nationalists fund is the Israel lobby because they believe that the second coming occurs in the land of Israel. And this is the covenant for those who believe in Christianity. The covenant is that the God of Abraham promised the land of Israel to the sons of Abraham. And this is the prophecy that many of these people seem to be bringing up in their interviews.
Well, Kusum, whatever the holy books of all the great religions may say, the rule book is one book that Trump has certainly thrown out the window. We need to take a short commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Your afternoon starts with ABC on TV1. World news, sports news, documentary. Stay informed, stay ahead. Every weekday, 12:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. ABC Afternoon, only on TV1.
ආර්ථික ප්‍රතිපත්තියක් අපිව ගෝත්‍රික කරයිද
සංගෘත ආර්ථික ප්‍රතිපත්තිය ලෝකෙ වෙන කොහෙවත් ක්‍රියාත්මක නොවුණු ලංකාවට විතරක් අනන්‍ය වෙච්ච කාරණාවක්.
අවුරුදු 30 ගානක් පැවතුනා නම් කතරම් ආර්ථික හිඟයක් ඇති වෙන්න තිබුණාද?
ලංකාවේ හාල් පෝලිං ඇති උනේ ඇමරිකාවේද?
ඩයි කරපු පරිප්පු ටික හොඳයි. මේ තමන් ඉන්න මහ පොළවේ හැදෙන කවුපිටික විසයි වගේ කතාවක්.
Sirasa Debater with AAT Sri Lanka.
ඉරිදා සවස 6ට.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Kusum Wijetilleke, the noted foreign policy analyst. Now, Kusum, there were some countries which condemned this war, or specifically the start of the war by the United States and Israel. Then there were many countries which, of course, condemned Iran's strikes against the Gulf states. But I think it's a little peculiar that we haven't heard a lot from the leaders of Russia and China. Yes, they did condemn the United States and Israel for starting this war, but since then they haven't really come down very hard on this, have they?
Well, Neeraj, from Putin's point of view, from President Putin's point of view, he has every reason to stand back and let this play itself out. We've already seen the spike in oil prices. I think this has been a 10% spike or 11% spike. That is enough to fund a Russian offensive in the Donbass for another 3-4 years, right? So Russia is coming out of this, and they will probably plug the gap that Iran sells in terms of natural gas, in terms of oil. They'll plug some of the gap that China will suffer because of the Straits of Hormuz. And coming to China, Xi Jinping has to also consider the economic issues, right? So this is the point that I think, again, when you think about China, you don't think about a country that is a democracy, because it's not. But then the Chinese government, the CCP and Xi Jinping, have to be extremely sensitive to the business sector in China and to the economic performance of the country, right? So they see, when they see conflict like this in a key resource-rich area, they will first consider what are the strategic implications from an economic point of view, because certainly this is nowhere near the Chinese mainland, right? But eventually it will come back to a consideration of power projection. How can they get involved? How can they start tipping the balance one way or the other? Now, the United States, in this sense, is fighting wars on multiple fronts. It's supporting the Saudis in Yemen, it's supporting Ukraine in the Donbass, it's supporting Israel in the Middle East. It's seeing their resources split up. That's why I mentioned the THAAD missile systems as well, because we see the US military as this sort of all-powerful, behemoth. But at the end of the day, even a juggernaut has a limit. And I think when you're fighting wars on multiple fronts, and you're fighting against countries like Iran and Russia that are themselves industrial powers, it is not so easy to guarantee results. And I think the limits of when Russia invaded Ukraine, what we saw in the next few years were the limits of Russian military power, because it was, despite being a much more powerful country, a much bigger army, a well-equipped army, because of the support of the United States, Ukraine were able to stave off Russia for 2-3 years now. I think this war will show us some of the limitations in the modern warfare context on the United States. Because nowadays countries have cyber warfare, they have drones, they have all sorts of cheap IEDs, munitions, and now there are other countries like Russia and China that are willing to support different sides in a war. So Russia and China will adopt a wait-and-see strategy. A war will always weaken the nation states that are involved. The United States will become weaker economically, politically, and militarily. Politically, especially because within the United States, as a democracy, there will be more and more pushback from the population. And that is where the government will have to go in one direction, with leaving the people standing by way of the road if they don't actually listen to the public. So Trump came into power based on populism. There's nothing populist about America bombing Iran or supporting Israel bombing Iran. And we are in a context where a lot of people in the United States seem to now have woken up to the fact that there is a lot of Israeli influence on American politics. This has always been something that's just beneath the surface, but now it's really come to the fore and people are talking about it openly. And I think this is going to create another problem, because you have to start justifying these operations. The more American service people come back in draping the flag in a coffin, Trump will start to provide more justifications for this war. And I think that's where this is going to get stuck.
Right. I want to get to the impact on Sri Lanka, but before that, how long do you think this war will last, considering that there are no unlimited stocks of drones and missiles on either side, including the ground-to-air missiles? So how long could this go on? Would it be a matter of another week or 2 weeks or several months? What's your best guess there?
Well, Neeraj, the thing is, as I mentioned, if you ask any Iranian what would be, the one line you can't cross, it would be to assassinate the Ayatollah. When you have a leader assassinated, the response has to be proportionate, and it has to satisfy the people who supported the Ayatollah within Iran.
Yes, and just yesterday, both Trump and Iranian officials categorically said there will be no negotiations.
Yes, of course, there's some reporting that suggests that American officials have reached out to Iranian counterparts, and they've rejected any conversations, any talks, and rightfully so, because even Midnight Hammer occurred under the pretense of negotiations with the United States, same this time around. So, in
terms of these wars, Kusum, there are almost always other countries which are willing to diplomatically move in behind the scenes and ensure that there is some conversation which can quickly start up. And in this case, Turkey, Egypt, and several other countries are still there.
You would think Turkey, but just yesterday, Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, basically said that after Iran, the next target will be Turkey, and that Turkey and Qatar are the primary funders of Islamism in the region. And these were the words that Naftali Bennett was saying. So I don't know if Turkey will be acceptable to the Israelis. Certainly, I would say the Gulf countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, they are taking incoming missile fire from the Iranians. So you would imagine that at some point it would be in their interest, as the people who border Iran, who are in that region, who would tell the United States, look, it's time to pull back. We can't afford to take any more casualties. And their economies, the Saudi economy had challenges. That's why they're liberalizing parts of the economy. That's why they are building the line across the desert, this futuristic city. That's why they're going into all sorts of investments abroad, into sports, into gambling. This is because Saudi Arabia understands that oil revenues alone cannot sustain them for the next 50, 100 years. Right? So they also understand that the economy is not what it used to be. They cannot have a self-contained economy.
So no one wants to continue a war for months and years. But what's your best guess here? I
would say 2 to 3 weeks. And I think within 2 to 3 weeks, the damage on parts of Israel, parts of Iran, certainly parts of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that damage will start to tell. Once investors start pulling out, once businesses start shutting, once the economy starts collapsing, these countries will have to come to the table. And as the allies of the United States, as the main belligerent, the United States will have to be the one to, I think, approach the Iranians and sort of say, like, let's end these hostilities and find an off-ramp that satisfies both parties and isn't perceived as a defeat, because that's the other thing. Nobody wants to, the United States and Trump doesn't want to be perceived as being unsuccessful in regime change, because he set himself quite a task. Remember, the negotiations were not about regime change. The negotiations were about the nuclear program. And the ballistics missile program. But from the negotiations to the bombing, it's become regime change. So if you don't succeed in regime change, then by your own measure, you have failed to meet the objectives. And from Iran's point of view, there's only a limit to which their country can take bombardment from Israel and the US. So this has to end within a month. I mean, if it goes on for any more than a month, Niresh, what will be left of these metropolis cities in the UAE and in Saudi? I don't know.
Right. Now let's look at the impact on Sri Lanka. And of course, we are always very vulnerable to external shocks. We've already seen issues with regard to tourism because of the Middle Eastern airlines and the airspace of so many Gulf countries being closed. And then we have our tea industry, which exports quite heavily to countries around the Gulf, throughout the Middle East. And then we have shipping as well. Don't forget that Colombo is a major transshipment port, and when the shipping is not going through the Straits of Hormuz or even now through the Suez Canal, then there's going to be a problem.
So I don't want to sound too dramatic, Niresh, but Sri Lanka's economy, one of our main weaknesses that contributed to the collapse into 2022 was our balance of payments issue, right? We spend far too much on imports and we don't export enough. 20 to 25% of our import bill is oil. The price of oil has spiked by 5 to 10% in the last 2-3 days. We could be looking at $100 oil if this goes on for more than a few months. We could be looking at $100 oil in a couple of weeks. You never know, depending on if a pipeline gets attacked, if a refinery. I think the main headquarters and refinery, the largest oil refinery in the world, owned by the Saudi Arabian state oil company Aramco, was attacked by multiple drones just in the last few hours. So Sri Lanka's balance of payments is going to struggle from the point of view of oil imports becoming more expensive. On the other side, global trade is going to slow down further, right? When shipping, when the Strait of Hormuz closes, shipping lines have to spend more insurance. Insurers have already pulled out, if I'm not mistaken, from insuring the ships that are going anywhere near the Strait of Hormuz. So that anyway, if you have a reduction in global trade, that's going to hit our exports, and that's going to hit global trade more generally. Then you have the dollar. The Sri Lanka has already seen 6% depreciation last year. We will have further depreciation this year. And as our exports suffer, we will have even more problems in terms of depreciation against the US dollar. That means a further cost of living spike. When you take these things in totality, and the fact that we are in a moratorium currently, this is the period where we're supposed to be making hay because the sun is shining. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. We haven't seen any huge growth in our exports. We haven't seen large foreign direct investments. We don't see major reforms to our economy. Since the government has announced some tax proposals that seem interesting. But overall, the economy isn't going to pick up. GDP isn't going to pick up to satisfy the debt sustainability ratio. So these are some of the direct economic implications that I think our audience will be interested in. But I want to take a step back and look at an even more important picture. I think when you look at foreign policy, Niresh, for a country like Sri Lanka, because of our economic issues, we like to think of foreign policy from the point of view of trade, investment, economics. But foreign policy and foreign affairs, international relations is not primarily concerned with economics. International relations is primarily concerned with territorial integrity, national security, sovereignty. So in a context where we've seen the world bifurcating, we see the upcoming spheres of influence is sort of the new lingo that's taking over. So Sri Lanka has to now consider its own position. Now, we can't forever be saying we are in a geostrategic location, some large percentage of the world's shipping lines, go past our coast. If we say all that, we also have to prepare for this, because if you are in a strategic location, that brings challenges as well as opportunities. So we have to look at upgrading our naval fleet. We have to look at intelligence sharing. We have to look at intelligence gathering. And all of this costs money in a context where Sri Lanka has to reduce its fiscal deficit. Sri Lanka has already started a program of reducing the number of people in the military, downsizing parts of the military. But on the other hand, we have to become more technologically savvy. We have to become useful in this region. Else we'll become a pawn. If you look at the world like a chessboard, you don't want to be a piece like a pawn that doesn't have any influence, doesn't have any use. We're not useful to anybody else. We have to start making ourselves useful as part of this global economic and military architecture. One way that we seem to be doing this is by joining forces with India, which is a major defense partner of the United States. And we've recently signed the defense cooperation agreements with India as well. So that's one way of looking at it. But we also have this other problem of a growing Chinese footprint. We are now a state that's partly being used by China for power projection in the Indian Ocean. So then we have to consider, how do we combat that? And we are in a context where I think you would notice just in 2026 alone, the number of foreign dignitaries, you had deputy prime ministers, the Governor General of Australia, you've had the Foreign Minister David Lammy of the UK coming through, you've had the European Commission come down. So you can see a lot of movement in Sri Lanka. I mean, it's not normal for Sri Lanka to have very high-ranking officials from Australia, New Zealand, the UK, India, all these in the span of 3-4 months, from the EU. So that shows that they understand that the Indian Ocean is a potential theater in the future. This is also, not as important as the Strait of Hormuz, but because Indian Ocean is bang in the middle of the globe, you sort of have to be prepared for any sort of escalation, even in this region. Now, we have declared the Indian Ocean region of peace, but I think with the number of Chinese vessels that are docking, with the Indian concerns for their own southern border and the security of the southern border, Sri Lanka has to become savvy. We have to start investing in a foreign policy. We have to start paying attention to the foreign policy intellectual sphere and try to understand how we can strategize beyond free trade agreements and foreign direct investment, because all the FDI, Dubai will tell you today, UAE will tell you today, all the investments and the 7-star hotels and the tourism will not matter once you get bombed by a few hundred Iranian drones. That stuff will not matter. So first and foremost, ensure that you don't leave any room available for that kind of thing. And if such a situation occurs, are you prepared to defend yourself? And that's something that we can't ignore as a country.
A lot of food for thought there, but I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Kusum Wijetilleke for joining me this evening. Lovely to have you again.
Appreciate it.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.